And so we finally have made it through the Judges into the kingdom period. And we're going to be focusing on the next two classes on the United Kingdom. Basically, when Israel and Judah were together. And it's just going to be three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. Well, that's not going to make things easy. Got another one? Or another AAA battery, maybe? Have too many advancements. Don't want to put that on you. Not even that one?
Give it a shot. Might not work. Give me a minute.
All right. Well, we'll just use the space bar then. So, Saul, David, and Solomon. Now, there is quite a bit that we know of them, but there's also quite a bit that we don't. And let's go into those as we come to it. You can go to the next one now. So we're going to be looking at from 1050 BC, oh, too far, 1050 BC to 930 BC. All right, now you can go to the next one. So one thing we know archaeologically and from the Bible is that slingers using sling stones is well known for this period. This is probably one of the things that you can think of most when you think of David, in his battle with Goliath, is the sling. And we do see this in the archaeological record as well. They're used to control herds, hunt, as well as warfare. You can see one that was found. Let's see if my laser actually works. Yep, there we go. One found there in Lahoun, Egypt from 800 BC, and then a replica here. All right, they were thrown over the head or on the side, and you can go to the next slide. Now for ammunition, they used a number of things. They have some clay balls here. They also used stones, such as David used, and lead. Now, when they were first in use, we can see these here. We found some of those during the Uruk expansion from our previous lecture. Over time, though, when it gets to the Roman period, they actually start using lead, so the projectiles seem to get smaller. And this is mainly because they get heavier, and so they can throw them pretty far. You can go to the next slide. We know that they were accurate to 400 yards to hit a group of people, accurate with 180 yards to hit a bundle of twigs. And according to Judges 20:16, about 25, 40 yards, they could hit a hair and not miss. These were very accurate people. I'm sure they're more accurate than some of us here with firearms today. These were incredibly skilled people. You can go to the next slide. There we go. We can see here depictions of Assyrians when they were attacking Lachish. Now, this is recorded in 2 Kings 18 and 2 Chronicles 32. They destroyed that city. And you have depictions of them doing so. You can see the slingers up here and the slingers of the defenders here. They were very accurate and very deadly, but they took a lot of training. It was more training to be a slinger than it was to be an archer. More training to be an archer than it was to be a fireman, a firearmsman. A rifleman, that's the word I want to use. And then it's only recently that we've been able to repeat such skills as was demonstrated in the past with firearms today. You can go to the next slide. Here is a PIM weight. So we're switching gears a little bit. A PIM weight, this is not a PIM particle for the Marvel fans out here, a PIM weight. In 1 Samuel 13:21, the word there is used. For the longest time, we didn't know what this word meant. Even just prior to Jesus' time, when the Old Testament was translated into Greek from the Hebrew, they didn't know what that word meant. They transliterated it. They just copied it down the same way we did. It means for a long time, this word was unknown. Until we found this ball here that says Pim on it, or specifically, Pim belonging to Zechariah, son of Yar. And we know now how much a Pim was. It was about 2/3 of a shekel. So this does a number of things. One, it shows that writing was there because you have something labeled in writing. You also have Samuel being written when it was supposed to be written. You can go to the next slide. And we have a number of other weights that we have found. The temple weight here found near the western wall, showing that 2 slashes equals a shekel. Again, showing that weight was in use, writing was in use. Also, that the temple was where it was supposed to be located. Now, this is important because today there are groups that try to say the temple was not on the Temple Mount. No archaeologist, to my knowledge, supports this, but certain groups do promote that. You can go to the next slide. We have a number of other examples of writing. We have the Zayat stone here. You can see writing, Probably can't read it, but you can see it. This is a 38-pound limestone boulder from Tel Zayit, Israel, about 35 miles from Jerusalem. So this is showing that Hebrew script was in use all over Canaan. You can go to the next. And we can see, based upon how they wrote this, that it was written from about 1000 BC, about the time of David, when he was ruling. We know when things were written based upon how they are written, how they are used, how the grammar, spelling, all that. The same way you can read the original Shakespeare and know that's not written within the last century or two. That's how they know this was written then. If I were to say I put something in the cloud, you would know that that statement was written within the last decade or so, not a century ago. And so based upon how they use words, how they spell words, they can figure out when it was written. Now this stone was found in secondary use as a building, or in a building. You will see that quite commonly. You can go to the next slide. Here we have the Gezer calendar, dated to about the 10th century. It says 2 months harvesting, 2 months sowing, 2 months late planting, 1 month cutting flax, 1 month reaping barley, 1 month reaping and measuring, 2 months pruning, and 1 month summer fruit. And no, it did not have September, November, and all those months there. Those are what we put there, just to make that clarified. But what's interesting is that, one, you have people writing out the calendar in somewhat of an exercise. This was not well done. This was a student writing this down, so somebody learning how to write. And the name was Abijah. You can go to the next one. Abijah is a very common name in the Bible. We see about 20 different mentions of it. 16 of those, the vast majority, are in this time period where this stone was from. Again, showing the Bible was written when it was supposed to be written. And that writing was relatively common. You can go to the next one. Here we have the Abel Beth Makkah inscription belonging to Benau. Excuse me, something in my throat. Again, from the correct time period, about this time of 2 Samuel. And it's interesting that so many of these saying, this is mine. If writing was not as common as some people try to claim, that wouldn't really do anything. Doesn't matter if you wrote down this is mine if people can't read. This is showing that writing was still relatively common, and maybe not as common today. There probably were a bit more illiterate people, but common enough to have a marker of ownership function when it was written down. All right, you can go to the next one. We also know how they lived archaeologically. You can see here a Israelite village, as far as what we found, and then a depiction of what that may have looked like. So there weren't that many cities before the United Kingdom period. There were a number that they took, but they didn't really build any, and a lot of people lived agriculturally. They lived in little villages around it. They would build in such a way as to have the outside wall of the houses function as a wall to the village. The only way in was this gate here. So you'd come in, you'd be in town, you'd leave, and then you'd have this nice wall there protecting everyone, because there was a lot of raiding going on from other nations as well as other tribes of Israel in the Judges period. And so this is how the United Kingdom period starts. And keep in mind that there is only one gate, and the gate was a big area of, as far as function in the village. Now, went back too far. Go forward one more. You're perfect on your timing. Go forward one more time. There you go. So here we have an Israelite house. Most of the houses were what we called a four-room house. You can see inside, outside, and a floor plan of it. Basically, there was an entrance here, a number of pillars and partitions that held up the second floor. So this is a courtyard, and this is where the animals would have been at night. The animals would have been out doing their thing. They would come in and have some protection at night. And these other rooms here is where they would have done their industrial activities, pottery, metalworking, basket weaving, whatever they did to supplement their income besides animal husbandry, this is where they would do it. Then upstairs, with a ladder or potentially stairs, you would have the bedroom and then potentially a balcony as well. So this is where they would live, this is where they would work. You can go to the next one. Now this is the same architecture from the Judges period all the way to the deportation. So through the kingdom period, the United and the divided kingdom period, this is how they lived as far as their houses went. This is partly, we think, due to the Mosaic law, because you could come in here and enter all these rooms without going through another room, meaning that if you were unclean, then you would not make other people unclean, or vice versa. So it was a way of keeping the clean clean and the unclean unclean, and then when night fell, You were then clean if you were unclean usually, and so then you could go upstairs and go to bed. Next slide. Another thing of note is the gate. In the Bible, we hear a lot about the Israelites' gates. In 2 Samuel, we have people doing business there. In Proverbs 31 even, it says, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. This was basically where all the business of the village or city was done, or even the kingdom, in the case of Jerusalem. Next one. And here we have a 9th century BC, so about 800s BC, gate in Dan. You can see a little pedestal where a chair would sit, a number of little holders there for a canopy, and even had a place for a kiln to keep things warm. They would close this at night, partly for protection, and then they would also use this as their meeting place. So everything would be done in these gates, and we see, just like here in Dan, a number of places that they would do this, a number of places where it seems to be kind of built up and made for this use of meeting. You can go to the next slide. So that is how they lived, at least how they lived at the beginning of the kingdom period, and some of that all the way through. But in the time of Judges, there was no real centralized government, at least not outside the tabernacle. And even then, with all the backsliding going on, the tabernacle probably wasn't that far reaching as far as their authority. And even among the tribes, they didn't really get along. They weren't a nation. They were just a conglomerate of independent tribes. They even fought each other. They almost wiped out Benjamin. Remember that. They almost wiped out an incomplete tribe. And they lived like this for 350 years. That is the equivalent of our country. 1776 was about that long ago. They lived like that for our entire history. So this is going to be really ingrained by the time Saul comes along. You can go to the next slide. When Saul comes along, though, things do improve a little bit, at least at the beginning. Saul begins to rule with some promise. He defeats some of their enemies, but he soon stops listening to Samuel and thus stops listening to God. And as such, the kingdom is rent from him. You can go to the next one. We know Saul, based upon the biblical chronology, reigned from about 1050 to 1010 BC. He had his headquarters in Gibeah, which is near Jerusalem, and is about 3 miles away on a place called Tel El Ful today. So not too far from Jerusalem. In this place, we can see that it was built up before Saul. We have ruins, basically remains of destruction from the 13th century. This may be when the other Israelite tribes came in and destroyed, or at least tried to destroy, the tribe of Benjamin. We don't know that for sure, but it's a potential. You can go to the next one. In the 11th century BC, we see that a fortress was built. This may have been by Saul, or Saul may have just utilized this. It was somewhat of a palace, somewhat of a fortress, which makes sense considering that he had a lot of work to do with some of these other nations. It measured by 20 by 20 meters, which is about 60 by 60 feet, and was destroyed again about 1000 BC. They then tried to rebuild it, but then it was abandoned, and so this may be David relocating the capital when he took over. And so, next slide. You can see it there today, or at least the hill. That building there is a modern building over top. So we can't see a lot, but we can see that there were huge towers on each corner, with the center blank. So it seems that this may have been like a parking garage for chariots and stuff like that. The corners then would have been where he would have done his business, where they would have been living, working, doing all the kingdom stuff. But it was nicely built for its time. So this wasn't just a ramshackle building. This was decently built, especially considering everything as far as how the Israelites were living at this time. You can go to the next slide. But now David. David ruled from about 1010 to 970 BC, so just at the turn of the millennium. You can go to the next slide. At this time, the world was in disarray. This is something called the Late Bronze Age collapse, or that period of. You can see all the major nations of the world at this time, and archaeologically, historically, you can see that they just fell into ruin. They didn't all do it at the exact same time, but over the course of decades to a century, they just fizzled out. And we don't know why. This is a mystery to historians. For some reason, all these nations, all these large nations, fizzled out. You can go to the next one. This began about 1150 BC and continued for well over a century. Next slide. Here we have Egypt and the New Kingdom period. Remember, that is the period where the Exodus occurred. Seems that ever since the Exodus, they just continued to lose power until they went into their third intermediate period. And really, Egyptians never ruled Egypt again, at least not until well after Rome. We have the Greek civilization falling into decay, called the Greek Dark Age. And when they came out of this, they were using a completely new alphabet. This is the same alphabet that we were talking about last time, the same alphabet that we get ours from today. The Hittite Empire, that collapsed and never comes back again. It basically dissolves into a number of small kingdoms and just completely fizzles out. The Assyrian Empire, that falls into collapse. They come back. They're probably one of the first ones to come back. And then they gain a lot of power afterwards. And then the Elamite, again, fizzles out into nothingness. So all these nations, basically, from the height of their power to nothingness within a very short period of time, and we don't know why. This may be God setting the stage for David. Maybe that it was Israel becoming more powerful and thus inadvertently causing this. We don't know. This is the chicken or the egg. Was it because God raised up Israel, or was to allow God to raise up Israel providentially? We don't know. But history abhors a vacuum. Same way nature abhors a vacuum. There was something going on here, and archaeologically, history-wise, they are confused about it. That's because they're not looking at the Bible. They do not trust the Bible. They do not hold it as a viable source, and therefore this is a mystery to them. But biblically and archaeologically, if you hold the Bible to be accurate, you can see how it all fits together. You can go to the next slide. We have many mentions of David. For a long time, it was said David was not real. He was a mythological character. Even until the last few decades, this was basically what they all said, secular scientists. You can go to the next one. We have here something called the Tel Dan Stele. This is found in Dan, of course, and you can see it here with writing on it. This is a fragmentary stele announcing the victory of the Armenian king over Israel. Again, another nation would come in, they would beat up Israel, leave this pillar here, a marker saying, nanny, nanny, boo-boo, I beat you. I'm bad, I'm good, you're bad, ha, ha, ha. And as long as that was up, it basically showed that I am subservient to you because I have your monument in my village. And usually tax or something like that would go along with it. And if you would destroy that, then they may come back and put up another one and beat you even worse. So no one really wanted to do that until you felt safe. But here you can see House of David. And it's read right to left, just for your FYI. And so this is showing that in the 9th century, other nations viewed Judah as belonging to David. It's very important how other nations see you. Think about when we came over here, when the Europeans came over into the Americas. We would ask one tribe, what's that tribe over there? And they would give us a name. And as many of you have no doubt knowledge of, some of those names weren't exactly good names. They were kind of derogatory. That's because that was how they were viewed. That's how they were known by the tribe that we asked. This is showing that Judah was known for David. We see this in other places. Later on, we'll see how Israel, even after Ahab was dead, after Ahab's line was ended, it was still called Omri land by Ahab's father. This is how other nations viewed Judah. He was not a mythological character. He was well known by everyone around him. He was a well-known character. Even centuries after his death, he was still what was linked with Judah. You can go to the next one. Here we have another stele, Mesha stele, or a Moabite inscription as it's called, again from the 9th century. It seems to parallel 2 Kings 3, and again has House of David. This one's a little bit more interesting as far as its history. This one was found in a wall as a secondary use. This one was found by some Bedouins. They are basically a tribe over there, a group of people, and there was some disagreement when it was found about who owned it. Or there was some disagreement as far as how much they're going to get for it on the antiquities market. I've heard both things. But what they did is they took this, they heated it up and poured cold water on it, breaking it, and distributed among their family members, among their tribesmen. And so archaeologists had to go and pay every single one of them some money to build it back together. And in doing so, you can see here, this little section was broken. And we've had to fill that in. So that is not there. That delta, that triangle, that D is not there. And that's why this D here is in parentheses. So what it actually says is House of David, House of David. But we know there was a letter there. Based upon the context, based upon every imaging that we can do, the only thing that would fit there is that D. There is no other reasonable explanation for that. Again, showing that David was well known by other nations, even more than a century after his death. You can go to the next one. Here we have the Karnak inscription. So in Karnak Temple in Luxor, Egypt, we have Pharaoh Shishak I, which is the biblical Shishak of 1 Kings 14 and 2 Kings 12. You can see a picture of him here. You can go to the next one. There you go. He has written on here, around him, all the names of places that he came and destroyed. Now, some of them are just gone, but we have one that says House of David. So, D-V-T. Now, D and T are both consonants, meaning that you both use those sounds with your teeth. And in this area, D and T are very interchangeable. You will see David used with a T later by other people living in this area, as well as you will see other words switching out D and T. So this is likely the oldest known mention of the House of David, about 50 years after his death. You go to the next slide. And this is how what David made of Israel. You can see here, when he came along, he left Israel in such a state. We also have Jerusalem here. This is how David built Jerusalem. When he found it, pretty much everything from this south was intact. That is the city that he found. He then built this area. You can see his palace here and a stepstone structure. And we have found what seems to be pieces of that today. You can go to the next one. We know from the Bible where David's palace was. One, because Nehemiah 12:37 talks about going from the steps of the city of David on the ascent to the wall and passed above the house of David to the water gate on the east. So then moving through the city. We also have David, after he conquered Jerusalem, when he is building his house, leave his house to go into the fortress, going down into the fortress, showing that it was above the fortress, above the city at that time. So we know that it was on the north side because Jerusalem is built on an incline. You can't build to the east, you can't build to the west because it's just basically a little divot there. And building south isn't great because it's going low. You don't want to go low, you want to go high. The high ground is best. You go to the next one. We know that this is from the correct time period by the pottery as well as the carbon-14 data. Many of you are probably confused about using carbon-14 data. If you recall from a lecture earlier, carbon-14 can be useful. Just like any clock, anything you try to use to measure time, it has to be calibrated. Carbon-14 can be calibrated because it is only taken in by living organisms, people, animals, plants. So a lot of times while they're working, they are eating olives, for example. And so in the fill, in the foundation underneath the building, you will find olive pits from people eating an olive and spitting it out. You can then use that olive pit to date that building. And some of these buildings, we know when they were built because we have it in historical record. This was built in this year in this calendar. We know that calendar to our calendar based upon astronomical events, such as a solar eclipse. So we can be relatively sure when that building was built. And now we have a calibration, a benchmark for that carbon-14. And we can do that and be relatively accurate within a few decades until about the year 1400, 1500 BC. At that point in time, the carbon-14 and the other archaeological dating methods don't line up. But for this time period, carbon-14 has been used many times to defend and support the biblical chronology, the biblical account. We also know that this was interlocked with the stepstone structure. And I'll show you pictures of that here in a moment. So you can go to the next one. This was a gigantic palatial structure. So we have the palace, the building, with the stepstone structure. That combined would be the tallest known structure until the time of Herod the Great. This was a monumental building project. One wall was 98 feet long and 10 feet wide. Another wall was 20 feet wide and over 100 feet long. And we know from these time benchmarks that it had about 100 years where it could have been constructed. That is a relatively narrow time frame. You can go to the next one. This is not the palace that the other kings lived in. That would have been Solomon's palace. We know that Solomon built another house. But this was still in use by basically the government, by the royal family. We have Nehemiah here mentioning it several times, Jeremiah mentioning that, one, they used it as meetings, they had a scribal chamber, they had a number of government offices functioning out of David's house. You can go to the next one. There. Now, of this building, of this archaeological site, only about 20% is uncovered. And this is a relatively new finding. You can go to the next one. So you can see here a map of the old city of David here. And right here is the stepstone structure and the walls they found. So you can see how big these walls are, and this is the stepstone structure there today, with some buildings, some rooms down here. Now, some have tried to connect this to the Milo that Solomon built, but it doesn't seem to fit best archaeologically. We are still unknown what that structure would be, the Milo. We don't know what that is. This, though, since it's interconnected with this house up here, seems to be basically from the time of David, plus all those other markers we talked about. Now, it's hard to get these two images together, but this is actually what's there today. If you went to Jerusalem, you could see these. Now you can go to the next slide. But this is how it would look all together. So you got some of the buildings here, the stepstone structure, and then the palace. Now, most of Jerusalem would be over this way. This is where most of other buildings of Jerusalem would be. And then this is north down here. This is where they would further build up, where Solomon would build his house and the temple and all those other buildings. But this is a very large building. And they had to put this here because there's kind of like a divot in the hillside there. This is called the Ophel. Not awful, Ophel. But it took an awful lot of rock to fill that spot. Sorry. You can go to the next slide. And here is another view of it, what it may have looked like in antiquity. Now, this map is a little different from the one I showed you previously. You can see here the wall is around the stepstone structure versus integrated with it. So we don't know exactly how that was, but we do know that it was there and a few other buildings in relation to that. So there is still some that we don't know. Remember, only about 20% of this area is excavated. You can go to the next slide. Now, here are the lower buildings. This is called Ahiel's house, the stone structure there. Even found a little toilet seat there, so they had somebody to use the bathroom inside, a burnt room, and something called the House of Buis. Now, Buis are these things here. Basically, when they were to take a scroll, take a papyrus scroll, roll it up, they would put a clay seal on it. They would then take a signet ring and press on that clay seal. Now, today we use that, or recently we've used that, but we used wax. Thankfully, they used clay because when a fire came in, it hardened that clay, and we have that seal now. We don't have the documents. That'd be great if we had the documents, but those were all burnt up. But we have these seals. And many of these seals, you can see, have writing on it. You can see who they belong to. You can go to the next slide. We have 176 seals. Now, they range from the 10th to 8th century, with the majority being 9th to 10th century BC. So, time of David, Solomon, a little bit after. You can see here a number of these do have just coat of arms. So, we don't know who they belong to. The same way, unless you had an idea of whose coat of arms these were, today you don't know whose coat of arms you see or whose logo you see half the time. Many will try to say that because these coat of arms, because these logos had no words, that these people were illiterate, ignoring the fact that they were on documents. They were on papyrus scrolls. Today we see a number of logos. Not all logos have words in them, and yet people will not claim that these companies are illiterate or people today are illiterate. It's just the image that they wanted to use. All right, you can go to the next one. So all this shows that there was significant writing at the time. They really do not have a leg to stand on if they try to say that these people were illiterate herdsmen and nothing more. That is not the case. We can see so many examples of writing at this time, or evidences of writing. You can go to the next one. We also have evidence of new cultural, basically a renaissance. We have these stone capitals here. They were on top of a pillar, that's why they're called a capital. This one here was discovered by Kathleen Kenyon. She was the one that dug up Jericho. She was poor on her analyses, but she is a good field archaeologist. She's found a number of things. She just didn't analyze them well. We've found others, but this is probably the best one, the one that is most intact. This was found downhill of David's palace, meaning that it most likely came uphill from that building. And these are Phoenician related. You can go to the next one. Israelite Phoenician style is what they're called, or Royal Phoenician style, which makes sense biblically because the King Hiram of Phoenicia helped build a number of these things. David and Solomon both utilized that country's skill and that country's ability in building a lot of these buildings. We see these other places in Dan, Hazor, Jerusalem, Kirbet Kiapha, Megiddo, and Samaria. These were prevalent throughout all Judah and Israel. And whenever you have a nation coming into your own or their own, they usually will see some sort of cultural renaissance. They will see a new style come about and just blossom like crazy. That is what we're seeing with this Israelite Phoenician style. There are a number of other things that are being produced that we find archaeologically that have this same style, both in Israel and other places. All right, you can go to the next slide. Last thing about this palace structure is underneath there seems to be some sort of opening. Now, the doctor that found it, Dr. Eliot Mazer, you can see a picture of her there. She's the one that found this. She went looking for David's palace based upon the biblical location, and she found something. She was a little bit off, but not too far off, and it was basically right there. She thought it wasn't integrated with the steps. She was a little bit wrong, and thankfully so. Underneath, she's found this tunnel, and it seems to be some sort of ancient waterway. It was a natural cavity in the bedrock that ran along the upper part of the eastern slope of the city. It was integrated in the construction of the stepstone structure. This may be the waterway that led to the pool of Nehemiah 3 and 12. You can go to the next one. And we know the entrance was buried about the 500 BC, so about the time of the deportation. And she was suspicious that this could be Joab's tunnel, how Joab initially infiltrated into the city of David, because he went in through a waterway. Now, unfortunately, Dr. Mazer has passed, and to my knowledge, no one else has taken up her mantle as far as digging this place out. Oh. It's fine, you can go to the next one. And so we may not find that anytime soon, but it is there, and there's plenty more that we can learn about that. So another thing of note, so again, this is the city of David. It's about 10 to 12 acres, and this is the Gihon Springs. This is mentioned a number of times in the biblical account, and it goes downhill. And again, this is the Temple Mount where it would be today. You can go to the next one. And around this location, some have thought they have found David's tabernacle. The Bible is pretty quiet about what the ark and the tabernacle were doing from when David danced and brought it into the city to the time of Solomon building the temple. We know it was in the city, but we don't know where. We don't know how they worshiped. They don't know anything from this time period, or I should say very little. We do have a mention in 1 Kings 1, starting in 32, of Solomon being anointed. He was taken down to the Gihon Springs, and they were told to get anointing oil from the tabernacle, which seems to indicate the tabernacle is nearby. And this place here is about 20 meters from it, so but pretty much right next door. Now, this is a stone structure, a partial stone structure, a relatively small one that could have the tabernacle over it, the tent around it and above. And some even think that they were trying to use some sort of permanent structures at Shiloh, because based upon the language there, they will argue for that. Nothing has been found archaeologically, but there is a decent argument for that linguistically. You can go to the next slide. And this is what they found. So here's a representation of it. And this was intentionally buried, meaning that this wasn't destroyed. This wasn't a pagan site that Israel damaged and broke up like they did a number of other places. This was intentionally buried, just like that altar that seems to be Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal. Reverentially buried. So this seems to be some sort of sanctified site and may have been buried because of Hezekiah's reform, covering everything that was not the temple, basically. You can go to the next slide. It has 6 chambers. The first one they call an antechamber, and it doesn't go this way. You come out and go in, come out and go in, come out and go in. So wall here, walls in between. So basically kind of just little nooks. This would have been an olive press, which makes sense since we know that the olive oil, the holy oil, was kept in the tabernacle based upon that 1 Kings passage. You can go to the next one. We have a room 3 here that has a platform that matches the dimensions of the ark, or could have been a sacrificial altar, because it does have a drainage system, and it has a standing stone. Now, standing stones were used both by Israelites and non-Israelites. But when Israel used it, it meant that God did something here. We have Jacob, we have Joshua, we have them doing standing stones whenever God did something miraculous, which would indicate that God did something miraculous here if this was an Israelite standing stone. Now, there is a lot we don't know about this. We don't know for sure that this is David's tabernacle, but it's close to where we would expect it from the biblical account. If you want to know more about this, there is a video on YouTube by grace.tv. Now, it's about a half-hour video, and they spend about 15 minutes of that on this. Otherwise, there is a Dr. Scott Stripling with the Associates for Biblical Research that goes a little bit more in depth in this. I just wanted to mention it here since the Bible is basically not mentioning what happens to the tabernacle during this time. Just this one verse is the only thing that really mentions. Yet we know from archaeological evidences that things can happen that the Bible doesn't tell us. The Bible doesn't tell us everything. Archaeology doesn't tell us everything. But where archaeology and the Bible both speak about something, we see near perfect overlap. This is just one of the things that archaeology may speak on, the Bible doesn't. You go to the next one. Real quick, with the last few minutes we have, I'm going to talk about David's Israel. You can go to the next slide. We'll probably recover some of this next time, but this is a place called Khirbet Kiafa, and this is probably one of the most interesting places archaeologically about David's rule. This is a fortress here that overlooks the Elah Valley, about 20 miles from from Jerusalem, not Israel. And it's a fortress. It was used as a defensive structure, and it seems to be a Jewish defensive structure. You can go to the next one. What is very interesting about this is that it has 2 gates. Remember from before, usually there's only 1 gate per place. This one has 2. You can see a 4-room gate here, and then 4-room gate here, a little bit closer view. You can go to the next slide. And it has a double wall. So here's the gate, and here's the double wall around it. This is called a casemate system. This requires a lot of organization, a lot of finance, a lot of basically planning, showing that this was not just a bunch of people living out in the middle of nowhere. When David ruled Israel, and to a lesser extent Saul, there was a centralized government body. They knew how to read, they knew how to write, they knew how to organize. They built some pretty impressive things. This was a really big nation, or becoming a really big nation. And we see this kind of building, this kind of architecture in other places in Israel. You can go to the next one. There we go. But what is most interesting about this place is there is only one burial layer. Remember from before we talked about how when somebody lived somewhere, they would build, they would tear down, leave just the foundation, build again, tear down, leave just the foundation, build again. In some places like Megiddo, we have 26 different layers. Here we have 1. That means this place was only in use during this time period for just a few decades, meaning that this place cannot be confused with other time periods. So whenever we see things that are found here, we know that they existed at this time period. So when we find these things other places, we know that they exist at this time period. So this casemate architecture is classic for Davidic architecture. We'll go a little bit more into that in a bit. But this is a truly interesting place. You go to the next slide. We know that this is Israel here, and we have to be very careful about that. Because if we're using this as a benchmark, saying that this architecture is Israeli architecture from this time period, and we find the other places, if we're wrong about the Israeli part, doesn't matter if we're right about the time part, that means everywhere else is a not Israeli as well. So if this was the Assyrians or the Philistines that came in and built this, then The other places were probably Assyrian or Philistine. So we need to make sure we are talking about Israel here. And we know that it was Israel because there were literally no pig bones found. Thousands and thousands of bones, no pig bones, just kosher animals. You go to the next one. We have Hebrew writing. We have this ostracon here. This writing up here, Hebrew, Proto-Hebrew writing, seems to be similar to 1 Samuel 8. It has a name, Ishbaal, son of Beta. Now, we know that this is not Saul's son, Ishbaal, because we have this Ishbaal's father there. But it shows that the name was in the correct time period, showing that the Bible was written about the correct time period. Go to the next one. We see that there were no idols here, no central place of worship, as we'd expect to find in other pagan cultures. And again, carbon-14 data puts it right where we expect it to be, and a number of Israelite pottery there. You can go to the next slide. Now, what is this place biblically? You can see there is on the border of Philistia and Israel. The best bet is that it's a place called Sha'araim, or Sha'araim. Can't pronounce that one well. Basically, 2 gates. You will find this mentioned in 1 Samuel 17:52, 17:20, and 1 Chronicles 4:27. You can go to the next, there we go. It's mentioned a number of places with cities in this area. So it means that this place probably should be in this area. And Kirbet Kiafa is very unique in that it has 2 gates. And this is also the place overlooking the valley where David fought Goliath. So this may be where David's brothers were when David came and fought Goliath. Or at least it's around that area. It's mentioned in the aftermath of that battle. So this is a very unique place. It shows basically the beginning of David's reign, what Israel was like as far as their building constructions and everything. And then further on, we see David continuing a number of these constructions. We'll stop there for today. Just got a minute or so to spare. We'll probably cover a little bit of this next time, just because we're going to go a bit more in it, but I don't think we have enough time to really get down to those details. But any questions as far as David and his rule of Israel? We see that he came in, to a lesser extent Saul as well, came in and started to build up Israel, taking them from an agricultural society into a truly far-reaching nation with a centralized government, with enough finances to build truly massive structures, and not only massive, but beautiful structures, especially based upon the time. The Phoenicians were the height of craftsmanship and beauty across the ancient world. That is saying something because he was able to afford those people. He was able to get them to build his structures. That is expensive. All this is showing that at this time, while everyone else is collapsing, Israel was being built up. Any questions on that before we end? Say again? Oh, the tabernacle? So that is the place of worship at this time before the temple was built. Moses, whenever they were wandering in the desert, was commanded to build the tabernacle, and so that was their center of worship. And so we know from the historical record that it existed in Shiloh for a time, and then David brings it into the city of Jerusalem. But the Bible is silent as far as what it was doing between when it was brought into Jerusalem and when it was exchanged out for the temple when Solomon built that. And we'll cover Solomon's temple a little bit next time. Does that answer your question? All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, we'll end there for today. Thank you.